Hello, I'm delighted to be here. My name's Professor Michael Lee. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Harper Adams University. Hopefully most people are aware of Harper Adams. I see some colleagues in the room. And of course, we share a vet school with Keele University, so it's delighted to be here in Keele today. So welcome everyone to this afternoon's Global Challenge lecture from the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Entitled The Food Systems Transition, How We Can Feed Ourselves Without Destroying the Planet or Our Health, which I think we'd all agree is critically important and very, very close to my heart with my background. So this is the first of this year's Global Challenge lectures, and we're delighted to have Henry with us to launch our 23-24 programme. Briefly, for those of you who may be new to these events, ILAS promotes interdisciplinary education and research, both at Keele and beyond. More information is available on the ILAS website, where you can also see videos of previous Global Challenge lectures. And that's just to note that we are also live streamed, and we have many delegates also online. So if you have questions at the end, please remember to wait for the microphone. So let me introduce Henry. It is our great pleasure to invite Henry Dimbleby to deliver today's lecture. Henry Dimbleby is the author of Ravenous, How to Get Ourselves and Our Planet into Shape, published in March 2023. This analysis of the food system, how it is manufacturing it and what to do about it, builds on the work that he did in the Independent National Food Strategy, described by Prue Leith, no less than the best government document that's ever come out. High praise. He is the co-founder and former CEO of Leon Restaurants. He also co-founded the Sustainable Restaurant Association and the charity Chefs in School, which brings restaurant chefs into school kitchens. In 2013, he co-authored the School Food Plan, a blueprint for government setting out actions to transform what children eat in schools and how they learn about food. It resulted in the introduction of free school meals for all children up to the age of 8 and cooking lessons being made obligatory for all children up to the age of 14. From 2018 to 2023, Henry was the lead non-executive board member of the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, serving under Michael Gove, Teresa Villas, George Eustace and Teresa Coffey. He has also advised the Labour Party on how to improve the sustainability and security of the food systems. Henry previously worked as a strategy consultant at Bain & Company, where he worked with business on strategy performance and improvement and organisational design. Before that, he worked as a journalist at the Daily Telegraph and a chef at the Michelin-starred Four Seasons Inn on the Park. Henry will be happy to take some questions at the end of the lecture for those watching online. There is an opportunity to engage through the Q&A portal on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will make sure that your questions are posed. For anyone joining us online, welcome. Please do join the conversation, and we will endeavour to pose any of your questions, so please do that. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Henry. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You actually missed a Secretary of State at DEFRA, but he was there so briefly, Ranald Jayawardena, who was there for a few days during Liz Truss's premiership. And in fact, that was on purpose. The fact that I actually served in the Department for Environment and Rural Affairs from 2018 to 2013 with 5 Secretaries of State and 4 Prime Ministers. And when you're trying to solve difficult problems in kind of long-term problems in complicated systems, that makes it quite tricky to do. I'll talk a little bit about that. I just want to say it's really nice to be back here in Keele. I wandered round this morning the campus. I just think it's such a fantastic university and such a great place to learn. I'm very jealous of those of you who are spending your time here as undergraduates. I thought it would be useful to talk today about what the kind of, when we did the National Food Strategy, I had done the previous work on school food, and I knew the risks of doing a independent review for government, and I also knew that you had to do 2 things which are actually very different things. The first thing you have to do is you have to explain why things are as they are. You have to tell a story about why the system is malfunctioning in the way it is. And the second thing you have to do is you have to recommend policies. And you know that on the policy front, if you get 50% of them in, you're going to be lucky. Policy making is, by nature, tactical. Almost all policies are made as a kind of knee-jerk reaction to something that's going on in the media at the time. And so what you're actually doing is you're trying to explain the story and position policies for when the moment comes to push them across the line. And what was interesting about the food system is that almost everyone's story who is engaged in it, almost everyone in the country, fundamentally doesn't understand why it's going wrong in the way it is. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit today about that story, the story we told, which we then told again in Ravenous. We wrote, my wife, as a journalist, she'd edited the food strategy for us, and immediately it was published. We thought no one sane is ever going to download a government document from a government website and read it. Apologies if you did that. You're in a very small and select group. We need to make it public, and so we wrote the book Ravenous. And I thought I'd tell the story, and then I'd talk a little bit about where I think we go from here, where I'm optimistic, where I'm pessimistic, what happens next. And obviously, no one knows what happens next, but I'll give you my best take on that. So we started the story in 1945, at the end of the war. Despite all the bloodshed, there were 2.5 billion people on the planet. That was more than there had ever been before. It had risen by just over 1 billion over the last 100 years. But over the next 50 years, due to improvements in sanitation and in medicine, scientists were projecting that the population would grow from 2.5 billion to 8 billion people. A huge increase. And up to that point in the story of mankind, when we had grown our population, we had simply dug up more land to feed ourselves. And what these scientists were pointing out was that we had run out of land, we had dug up most of the land. There wasn't, with current agricultural yields, going to be enough land to feed 8 billion people. And this was a very, much as nuclear war in my childhood was a kind of running theme on the existential theme on the front of newspapers, this was on the front of papers through the late 40s, early 50s. This kind of Malthusian collapse was the forefront of concerns that society had. But what these scientists had not reckoned on was a man called Norman Borlaug. He was a botanist from Idaho. He'd grown up during the Great Depression. He had seen hunger on the streets. He'd witnessed food riots. He'd seen people starving. And he'd set about a lifelong mission to ensure that people ate enough, had enough food to eat. And he was sent by the Rockefeller Institute towards the end of the war to Mexico to see if he could improve the farming techniques there. And he arrived in Mexico in the early 40s and wrote to his wife that the things he had seen had clubbed his mind. He said the soil quality and the quality of these people's life is so poor, they're barely scraping by. And he had an idea. So he had heard about a Japanese plant breeder who'd grown a short-stemmed form of wheat, which wasn't particularly high-yielding. But the problem with wheats at that time was that the high-yielding wheats, when the wind blew, the heads were too heavy for the stalk, so they lodged, they got blown over. And he had this idea, well, maybe if I could take this short-stemmed wheat and breed it with the higher-yielding wheats, I could combine that with nitrogen fertilizer and modern irrigation techniques, and I could solve this problem. And he set about this. He actually, in those days, wheat breeding was a very, very painful, laborious process. He had to take the flowers off each of the wheat, tap pollen onto the different heads of corn, seal those flowers into in little envelopes. He set up 2 research bases, one by the sea and one in the mountains, which enabled him to have 2 seasons of breeding a year, so he doubled the amount of time. And through persistence and luck, he was successful, and he bred this much higher yielding form of wheat. He gave it initially to the popular Mexican farmers. He thought people would be suspicious if he tried to spread it, and they planted it. Others saw how their yields improved, and it was a tremendous success. By the time he left Mexico in the 60s, it was exporting wheat. When he'd arrived, it was importing half of its wheat. And that experiment was repeated for maize and for rice, and in what was known as the Green Revolution, we solved this problem. Ironically, it turns out the Green Revolution, we solved this problem of how to feed ourselves. And if you look at 3 lines on a chart, you know, this is a miracle. So this is the green line here is the amount of land we farmed from the beginning of the 19th century. The grey line is the population, and the red line is the number of calories we produce. And we actually now farm actually slightly less land than we did when the Soviet Union collapsed. A lot of very marginally productive land went out of production. The population grew as expected, but we now produce from slightly less land almost twice as many calories per person on the planet as we did in 1945. It's an unimaginable piece of human ingenuity. And in fact, although it sometimes doesn't look at it from reading the papers, there hasn't been a famine this century that has not been in a country where there has been warfare or political corruption. We have enough calories worldwide. We're just sometimes prevented to getting them where they need to go. But unsurprisingly, when you solve a problem, you often cause others. And one way to understand the extent to which the food system has come to dominate the environment is to look at the mass of all the animals on the planet. So this is in 10,000 BC, the estimated mass of all the animals on the planet, wild animals defined here as land-dwelling vertebrates and birds, and 2.5 million humans. This was also the period of the beginning of the Holocene, when stable climate enabled us to invent agriculture. Before the Holocene, the climate wasn't stable enough to allow you to plan next year's crops. And if you now compare that to the same scale with what we see today, it's a very different picture. So the wild animals have dwindled initially thanks to our enthusiastic hunting of megafauna, and then just as monocrops overtook the land, the animals kept by humans, horses, dogs, cows, horses, dogs and cats weigh almost exactly the same as the wild animals. And the animals that we rear for meat to eat, about 80 billion of which we slaughter every year, now weigh twice as much at any one time as all the humans, and 20 times as much as all of the wild animals. And this destruction of nature continues to this day. So this chart shows the increase in wheat yield. So farming ingenuity has continued from 1970 to the current day, and then the destruction of bird life in the UK, the number of birds. We have the fewest wild birds of any country in Europe. If you look at this picture from 1970, by the way, to today, the World Wildlife Fund does a Living Planet report that it publishes, I think, every year or every 2 years. They estimate that since 1970, the populations of wild species on the planet have declined by 69%. If that was the population of mankind, it would be the same as wiping out the population, the people who live in North and South America, China, Africa, and Oceania. I mean, it is unparalleled destruction of nature. And it's not just nature that's a problem. The food system is also the second biggest producer of greenhouse gases after energy. And this was probably the most frightening chart that we saw in all of the work we did on the food strategy. So this is a chart, there are two versions of it. One's created by NASA, one's created by the UN. And it shows what will happen, what is projected to happen to yields, crop yields, in a 1.5 degree to 2 degree global heating. And what you see is actually wheat in the north is projected to increase its yield. Plants like carbon dioxide, it's a food stock for them. They like water and they like warm weather. These plants are certainly in the northern hemisphere, wheat. But if you look at the equatorial zones and the southern hemisphere, the yields on rice and on maize are projected to decline. And that might be gradually, or it might in some cases be quickly. So the Mekong Delta, for example, which is the biggest rice exporting region of the world, in a 1 meter sea level rise scenario, half the Mekong Delta would be underwater. And when I looked at this chart, when we looked at this chart, it just looks like starvation, mass migration, warfare, massive redistribution of resources from the equatorial zones and the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. And it's not just the environment, the planet, that our food system is destroying. It is also destroying our health. So food is now by far the single largest cause of avoidable ill health. This chart shows the years lost to avoidable causes, and all of the kind of mauve bubbles are diet-related diseases. By 2035, the NHS project they're going to be spending more treating type 2 diabetes, which is just one food-related condition, than they do today treating all cancers. And this is now something, interestingly, within this government. It isn't in health, where Steve Barclay is quite ideological about public health, doesn't like to intervene, sees the job of the health service to mop up, to treat people when they get sick. It is now the Treasury who is most worried about this, because they have seen that we have 2.5 million people out of work. The four major conditions that they're out of work for are type 2 diabetes, hypertension, coronary heart disease, and musculoskeletal problems, all of which are directly linked to food. And if you play that forward, what you get is the NHS grows and grows and grows, because we can't let it go down, sucking money out of the rest of the state. And meanwhile, we become less productive because we're unable to work. So we end up not just sick, but also impoverished. And whichever government wins the next election, if they don't deal with this, in 10 years' time, these issues are going to be crippling any administration that's in power. And these problems are visited disproportionately on the poor. So this chart shows for various conditions, the bars are, from the left-hand side, the least affluent 10% of postcodes, to the right side, the most affluent, and it shows for all of these conditions, while they are prevalent across society, if you live in less affluent areas, whether it's preventable mortality, heart disease, cancer, dental decay, childhood overweight or obesity, you are more likely to suffer if you are living in poverty. And the cost of all of this, even today, is huge. Funnily enough, this was a chart that when I first saw it, I didn't believe it. So this is various NGO, non-governmental organizations, estimates of the cost of the environmental and the health harms of the food system. It's about, the largest one, 94 billion. That means that about the food costs about the same amount as you pay for it at the till. If you were to pay for those costs, you had to pay twice as much for your food. And I looked at this and I thought, this is just NGOs ramping it up, trying to kind of turn it up to 11, exaggerate the problem so they can get action. And actually, I have come to believe, and I've been doing some work with the Institute for Fiscal Studies recently, that the real cost is much higher than this. This is an underestimate. Now, that doesn't mean that food costs have to double, because if you don't charge for a cost, no one cares about it, so you just ignore it. If we could focus innovation on the food system to make it less environmentally harmful, less harmful to health, it does not mean that the cost, but actually, except for meat, would probably be not that much more expensive than it is today. So, but how do you solve a problem like this? Has anyone here, I asked this question before, but I imagine in this room someone actually might put their hand up. Has anyone here been involved or done an independent review for government? No. If you get the, yes, I knew there'd be one. So if you get the chance, I strongly recommend you say yes, because it is, in many ways, it is, you're on a hiding to nothing, particularly if you look at your Twitter feed, you're attacked for being too left-wing, too right-wing, too vegan, too meat-loving, whatever it is. You've got people coming at you from all angles. But you have this extraordinary privilege of being able to use the calling power of government to get whoever you want on the phone, on a Zoom call, by the next week in the world to help you solve your problems. And the first thing we did was we said, who really understands how to deal with complex problems like this? Let's get them on a phone, get them talking to each other, helping us how to solve this problem. And all of them said, well, you need to take a systems approach. Like, everyone said that. And we were like, great. And they were like, okay, well, what is a systems approach? Like, what does that actually look like in practice? And there, the answers were quite varied. So quite a lot of people said we had to map the system. That's the first thing we had to do. And they showed us this chart. This is known as the Foresight Obesity Map. And it's trying to show all of the factors, economic, psychological, developmental, infrastructure, and how they interact, the feedback mechanisms between them that mean that our food is making us sick. And there is, I had been, even before I saw this map, a fan of, there's a whole field of research. If you Google spiders on drugs, there is a whole field of research where people give drugs to spiders and then observe what shape webs they make. And actually, I checked it this morning. There's a quiz on the Wall Street Journal where they show you the web and you have to guess what drug that spider was on. And it's actually quite easy. So the guy on, the spider on marijuana is kind of doesn't really get going and then kind of weaves off. The guy on, the most amazing one is the guy who's taken LSD, who creates this extraordinary kind of fractal pattern. But this looks very much like the web created by the spider on speed. And it's kind of sobering. It makes you realize definitely how difficult it is to change complex systems. But if you show this to a politician, or if you try and say, well, how do we act? It actually is almost counterproductive. They say, I'll focus on something easier, like stopping the boats or something simple. The other thing that we got showed was this chart. So this is actually a very useful chart. This chart shows how the responsibility for food is spread like a thin layer of jam across government. Each of those circles represents a government department, and then it lists out what responsibility they have for food. And this does create problems because they pull against each other. So, for example, I was fortunate enough to, or privileged enough to observe the fight when they were talking about whether or not they push back the legislated for ban on advertising of junk food to children. I saw how the debate went, and basically it went, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport saying we're not going to have, speaking for the advertisers, saying we're not going to have any children's programs if we do this. DEFRA, my department, saying our food sector is our biggest single sector. We're going to destroy that if we do this. And then you had the Department for Health kind of being left there trying to mop up the mess. And actually, this is where, but this issue is not unique to food. You have to cut government up in some way, and there will always be overlaps. But it is problematic, and when you have a complex problem, it requires number 10 to view it as a complex problem and create cross-departmental resolve, a bit actually as they've done over a few administrations now, from back to Blair, with climate change. But that is tricky, and it is particularly tricky if you have 4 prime ministers and 5 cabinet ministers. But it's not a fundamental cause of the problem. It is one reason why the problem is hard to solve. So what were the fundamental causes of the problem? There are basically, if you go right back to system dynamics, the science of system dynamics as it was invented at MIT in the 50s, what you have to set out to do is try and work out what are the dominant feedback loops. Look at that crazy spider's web and say, okay, what are the things that are really going wrong and how can we break those feedback loops? And luckily in the food system, there are two things that are very obviously going wrong. Feedback loops that are broken. One is what we called the junk food cycle. So we have an evolved appetite that gives us disproportionate pleasure eating foods that are highly calorie dense, sugary, fatty, salty, so that we will expend extra calories to hunt down that food. And when that food is soft and low in insoluble fiber, it fills us up less quickly. So it gives us pleasure, we eat it, and it fills us up more quickly. And food companies, unsurprisingly, have noticed that, and they have spent increasing amounts of their marketing and research budgets selling us that food. We've eaten more, they've sold us more, we've eaten more, they've sold us more. They have made a lot of money, and we have got sick. It shouldn't be a surprise that there are 28 different kinds of Kit Kat available for sale in this country. It is simply the cause of this feedback mechanism. And to give you a scale to which it's taken over our food system, so in the UK today, we spend £2.2 billion on fresh fruit and veg every year. We spend £3.9 billion on confectionery. That is one category of the kinds of foods that do us harm. This is, I think, the most difficult thing to fix in the system. There are two ways to do it. You either cut the commercial incentives of companies, or you change our appetite, and I'll come on a bit to that second one. And it is impossible, I think, largely impossible for companies to do anything on their own, because in the end, someone else who's less scrupulous will just come in and do it anyway and sell us the stuff. And funnily enough, I was with the CEO of one of the food companies recently talking about what he could do. And I said, there's lots you can do on environment, but I think you're stuck on health. You know, I think it's very tricky. And then the week afterwards, they released Kit Kat breakfast cereal, and it was branded as delicious and nutritious, and there was a star on the nutritious doing quite a lot of work. It contained B12. But Nestlé's mission statement is to be the #1 provider of nutritious food to the world. So the CEO of one of the supermarkets got in touch and said, look at their mission statement. That's why they've had to call it nutritious as well as delicious. I wrote to him and said, when I said you couldn't do much, you could at least not actively mislead people. And this is what it looks like, the junk food cycle. This is two huge companies battling it out on the supermarket shelf at children's eye level. The other feedback loop that's going wrong is what Siddhartha Dasgupta, the economist from Cambridge, called the invisibility of nature. So Dasgupta coined this phrase in an extraordinary piece of work, The Economics of Biodiversity, which he wrote for the Treasury. Like, how do we think about how to protect nature? It's 600 pages long, and brilliantly, when his civil servants said that maybe he should do a summary, he was like, no, this is it. This is the work. And they, in the end, did a summary, which he kind of half-heartedly edited. But it's not the original, if you're interested in the subject, the original 600 pages are electric, and the summaries are not really worth the reading. But what Dasgupta pointed out is not only is nature literally quite hard to measure, a lot of it is silent, it's invisible, it's underground, underwater, it moves about without regard for man-made boundaries, but also that we don't even try and measure its value. It's not in all of the systems, or most of the systems that we use to measure human success. It is not there. It's not in your wallet. It's not on the balance sheet of companies. It's not in the way that we measure GDP. So he says, of course we're destroying it. It's a free resource. Why wouldn't we destroy it to create money. And in fact, he argues that it's worse than that governments worldwide globally subsidize the destruction of nature to the tune of about $500 billion a year, causing $4 to $7 trillion of damage. We're not just giving nature a zero cost, we're giving it a negative cost. We're paying agriculture, big ag, big fishery and fossil fuel to destroy the planet. We're giving them subsidies to do that. What's crazy about this is that even like the most libertarian economists would think that was madness. You know, it is insane. So the question then becomes, if I actually put nature in its place, if I try and create a food system while restoring nature and sequestering carbon, can I solve that equation? Is it possible to produce enough food while doing it sustainably? And the answer is that it is possible, and it's possible for a couple of reasons. The first is that actually a lot of the land that we farm is quite unproductive. About 20% of the land that we farm produces 3% of the calories. And it turns out that quite a lot of that land is also quite well suited both to carbon capture and to biodiversity restoration. And that means that if we don't farm that land and we give it over to other causes, we can get enough food, restore nature, capture carbon. But we have to do one thing in order to be able to do that. We have to eat less meat. And this chart here shows the area of land that we use to feed ourselves in the UK. On the right-hand side, those hexagons are land abroad that we use to feed us. We actually feed ourselves from about almost twice the area of land that we have here in the UK. And if you look at that, the green areas are all either dairy or beef pasture or areas of land used to create feed to cattle. The yellow is land used to feed poultry. The blue is land used to feed pigs. 75% of the land that we feed ourselves is used to feed animals or to graze animals. And that is just a staggeringly inefficient use of land. And actually, it wouldn't. So we estimated that you had to, in order to fix that equation for the UK, you had to eat about 30% less meat. The UK would actually look pretty similar to how it does. It would mean that we would take between 5 and 8% of land pretty much out of production altogether, that our pasture would go from about 68 to low 60s as a percent of the agricultural land. It would look similar. And actually, eating meat, 30% less meat, that is if you eat meat at every meal, 1 meal a day, it's 2 days a week. It is not radical. You wouldn't think that this thing had become a culture war at the Tory party conference. I actually explicitly, by the way, I think I'm slightly responsible for meat tax. There's a large part in the book and the food strategy saying why a meat tax would be disastrous from an electoral point of view. And I think it is like, in the focus groups that we did, meat was just unbelievable. People would just want to rip each other's throats out. Luckily, they were on Zoom for most of the thing. But it was very controversial, but we have to do it. So what does a good food system look like? We put high-level targets in place. So we said, if you wanted to get to a system that is healthy and environmentally friendly, you'd have to increase consumption of fruit and veg by about 30%, increase fiber by about 50%, reduce junk food by about 25%, and reduce meat by 30%. And then how would you do that? We kind of looked at what the strategic objectives were. So the first was to break the junk food cycle. And that was about doing two things. One was making it less attractive for people commercially attractive to market this food. And the other was to take some of that money and support diets of those who were living with not a lot of money. And so we recommended a salt and sugar reformulation tax. We recommended restrictions on advertising, a bunch of measures to make it less attractive, all of which, funny enough, were incredibly popular. We trialed everything with focus groups and quantitative research. And then you take that money to improve access on point two. How do you reduce diet-related inequality? You increase availability to free school meals. You do free school meals during the holidays, which Marcus Rashford, funny enough, I sent the CEO of Manchester United at the time the part one of the food strategy and asked him to give it to Marcus Rashford, and he amazingly did, and Marcus Rashford got in touch and said, I want to campaign for some of these measures, which is one of the more surreal experiences of my life. So school food during the holidays, increasing Healthy Start vouchers, which give vouchers for fruit and veg and milk to families in poverty with young children. And there is a lot of evidence to show that works. Funnily enough, the bit about giving vouchers for fruit and veg is very politically contested, both on the left and on the right. So the left think you should just give money. It's not dignified to give people fruit and veg vouchers. The right tend to think you should give less, benefits in total. But actually, it is the one thing, amazingly, that works. So if you give people fruit and veg vouchers, there's a project going on in Hackney at the moment. 5% of the children in those families have gone from eating their 5 a day to 64%. And critically, the parents sleep better, are less stressed. And if you go and talk to parents who are living in this situation, the things that really stress them out are trying to give their children healthy things, which if they reject them, they can't afford to give them something else. And just things as simple as having a fruit bowl on the table, and if you see an apple going soft, feeling that's a waste of money. So we argue that actually those things were proven to work, liked by people who were in receipt of them, and there wasn't any other way of doing that. The third thing was to make the best use of the land. Now, this is an area where we should be in the ascendancy in this country because we are able to change the way in which we spend the £3.4 billion that used to go to our farmers under the Common Agricultural Policy. But basically, if you stop subsidising them to do one thing and pay them to restore nature, sequester carbon, while increasing slowly the the regulation benchmarks, we should be able to make that happen. And I'll talk about very briefly at the end about whether or not we're going to. And then the fourth thing is that we need to create a long-term shift in our food culture. So we actually need to eat more cooking from scratch. 55% of the food we eat is processed. 85% of that is deemed too unhealthy by the WHO to market to children. We need to change our food culture. And when you say that, some people think, just get real, that's not going to happen. The genie's out of the bottle. And I do think on the health side, there are two ways that we could go. I think we could go down the drugging route. We could go down the drugging of appetite route. So semaglutide, which is marketed as Wegovy or Ozempic, is a very effective drug for making you not feel as hungry. If you're one of those people who has more hunger than others and you lose a lot of weight on it, you have to stay on it for life, but you lose a lot of weight. And that is just one of what will be a bit like antidepressants. It's like the Prozac of these drugs. There are a whole bunch following. And I can see a world in which that is how we deal with this problem. Political will is so cramped that we just end up drugging it. And it would be 30 to 40% of the population. And there are all sorts of problems with that, which maybe we can get into in the questions. By the way, if you have a BMI of 40, 45 all your life, you've been miserable and sick because you have an appetite that makes you food. I actually think these drugs, I would recommend that you go to. I'm not completely against the drugs, I just don't think they're the way to solve the whole problem. But I do think there's another future. We have changed our food culture enormously from the Industrial Revolution when we moved into cities 60 years, 70 years before Europe did. We disconnected ourselves from our landscape, through the kind of processed food boom of the 60s and 70s, and now going on the retail side and the restaurant side, I would argue being more creative than countries like France and Italy, whose food culture has become stagnated. So I do think we can change the food culture, and we should try. And I can see that, I was talking to a group of school kids the other day, school children about this, and I was saying, you used to be able to smoke on the aeroplane. They're like, what? It's like, yeah, you used to be able to. When I was young, you could smoke on the aeroplane. There was a tube carriage where you could smoke, and the door opened up, and smoke would come out, and people would stand there like this. You could smoke on the bus. Whenever you went out, you smoked. And they were like, are you serious? And I do think there is a chance, if we fight for it, that we actually might look back on this period of time and think, God, we ate that stuff? But I don't think that is necessarily going to happen. I think we have to fight for it. So what's going to happen next? I think that on the environmental stuff, funnily enough, notwithstanding, so we had, under Michael Gove and then George Eustace, we had changed the principles of our farming system so that we would incentivise farmers for environmental public goods rather than for producing food. That, it turns out, was they were doing, actually, I think if you look back at it, an extraordinary job at bringing a coalition of NGOs and farmers with them on that. And then you had Truss signing the Australia trade deal, then becoming Prime Minister and putting in, calling DEFRA the growth department. And then you had Therese Coffey, who's now in there now, who actually, funnily enough, is very focused on nature and carbon, but it's just quite rude. And so it's really interesting. Like, being rude is like, it actually is a problem because it means that everyone assumes the worst of you, and it just makes it very difficult to get anything done. But I am actually, whoever is in the next administration, I am relatively optimistic on the environmental side because I don't think the costs, it's not as expensive a transition to make. I think it is clearly electorally popular. Despite what you hear, we love nature in this country, and it's going to be quite hard to unwind. So I think it'll come in fits and starts, but I'm optimistic that will happen. On the health side, you have a fascinating thing going on at the moment. So you have the Tories saying we don't want to intervene, although Treasury now is thinking, well, maybe we do. And then you have Labour terrified of being, for the next election, of doing anything that will upset the red wall. So you have, Angela Rayner talking about brown food's okay, it's fine, I want to eat my good northern food. Wes Streeting also kind of saying, well, I don't want to tell people what to eat. And so it's interesting to see where they go. Funny enough, I was talking at the Hay Literary Festival. Wes Streeting had done an interview the day before. I talked quite a lot about why I thought he was making a mistake. And he turned out he was in the audience, which I hadn't realised. And he DM'd me. It was the first time anyone's ever slipped into my DMs, let alone potential free future, and said, don't worry, it's okay, I understand. So I think on health, we'll wait and see. I think it'll be very difficult. And funny enough, what I'm trying to do now with my life is just work on the bottom up. With Chefs in Schools, we've transformed the food in 100 schools. We want to do 5,000, which will be a quarter of the schools in England over the next 5 years. And that's what I would say to you, is that we can't wait. So actually, any change is a combination of top-down. You need government interventions. You need changes in laws, but that is necessary but not sufficient. What actually changes the food in a school is someone who cares cooking great food. What actually changes anything is someone who cares taking care. And you cannot pass a law to make people take care. So I would urge you, if you care about this problem, just look around you and choose one part of your life where your care can make a difference. That might be teaching your grandchildren or godchildren to cook. It might be going and volunteering at your local food bank. It might be talking to a shop near you about how they're laying out food. Just talk. And even, if you're a parent, ask to go and have lunch in your child's school. It is actually, it's really good fun. Particularly in primary school, it's like you're treated like a kind of royal visitor. You have to go down the queue and shake hands. In secondary school, it's slightly less, they're all a bit embarrassed to see you. But actually, that simple act of saying someone is watching has been in so many of the schools that we went into. They decided to change because someone said, actually, we can do better. So I urge you, whatever you do, just choose one part of, if you like this, if you're interested in this subject, choose something in your life and be the person who says, we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. That was fantastic. Can I have a microphone for people at home? Because I want to leave Henry my microphone. Can I just have it for a second?
You can come. We could come and do here like two singers doing it.
So, Henry, that was great. And please, people, think about questions. And we've got questions online as well. So if I may kick off with Chairman's prerogative. Yeah, there's so much great stuff coming out of the National Food Strategy, and we thank you and everyone involved for the insights there. I suppose the comment about coming down with a specific target for a reduction. Let's take, for example, meat. So a 30% reduction in meat. But of course, there's variances around that. It's clear now that there is actually a group that need to eat more meat, not less, and therefore the danger of a reduction target, particularly the elderly. We are in an aging population. You mentioned yourself, sarcopenia or musculoskeletal disease is going down, so we actually need a higher consumption of high-quality DAS protein in that group. Also, young women. Young women in the UK are the first ones to take on a more removal of livestock from their diet, and we've seen the highest levels of iron deficiency, selenium deficiency, vitamin D deficiency in that group of young women. So how do we get a very complex message to be more balanced and nuanced? Thank you.
So it's a really interesting question. And funny enough, I don't think it's just meat. So in Hackney, where I am at the Harmond Hospital, we're getting rickets, we're getting all these kind of Victorian diseases of that, what you call hidden hunger. We have very high levels of obesity of people eating basically refined carbohydrates and vegetable oil made to look like food without any nutrients in it. So it's a big problem. I think that you have to, when you choose like the big problems to tackle, you have to, at a kind of political level, be quite clear. And so if you read the book, there is all sorts of nuance around what kind of meat, et cetera, et cetera. But it is, in my view, from the environmental point of view, it is so much more important than other than fossil fuels and almost every other problem. Plastics, that are all this stuff that actually you just need to say it and say it again and say it again and say it again. And then you have to hope that in the local, those people who are themselves not eating enough meat, or not eating meat but then finding the nutrients from other things, because you can be a healthy vegan, as Novak Djokovic has proved. But I think that you can't worry, because if you get into the yes but no, but yes but no, but it's just like no one hears anything. So I think there are often, always, trade-offs you make in communication.
Absolutely. But Novak Djokovic has a really good nutritionist to help balance that, of course. And not everybody has a nutritionist at hand.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and a balanced omnivorous.
And then obviously this applies to the Western world. So in developing countries, a lot of people need to eat a bit more meat, would be better off eating. But it's quite small as a percentage of the population, the number of people in the UK who don't eat enough meat. It's quite a small problem.
It's just a rising issue in young women, particularly, because they're the first ones to act. And we're seeing like 25% of the population iron deficient. Yeah. That's really quite scary in a developed world. Okay, questions out. Yes, Tim.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Henry, for a wonderful talk. I mean, a sort of perfect launch for our Global Challenge series this year. I've got a couple of questions from the online audience. First one very short. I'll probably ask them both at the same time. Do we need to talk less about calories and more about nutrition? And then the second one from Dr. Sam Holder, who says, thanks for the talk. I work at Urgency, the international network of community-supported agriculture. Do you believe that industrial models of agriculture are necessary to feed the world? What's your opinion of territorial food systems that rely on short food supply chains, local producers and resilient networks of regional food production? Thank you.
Okay, so on the first one, calories versus nutrients, I think that as an individual, and I write quite in the book, start the chapter on this with my daughter Dory leering over me in the morning when I just woken up saying, Daddy, were you always this chubby even when you were young? So if you are someone who has struggled with your weight, who has an appetite, and if you look at the graph of overweight, it is clear that there's something going on in the food system. There is a tail of people who have these appetite problems, other people who can be drugged. If you're very severely, you can be drugged out of it. I always say to people, focus on your appetite. So eat the foods, nutritious. If you focus on counting calories, you're just fighting hunger. You have to try and lean into how do I solve the hunger. So focus on appetite, food, lots of fibrous veg, lots of food that's got you know, a lot of water in it, not too calorie dense, etc., etc., etc. And then if you do that and you exercise, and we also talk about how exercise is pretty bad for making you lose weight, but it's pretty good for almost everything else. If you eat a quality diet and you exercise, even if you do lose weight, on all of those measures of risk, you will be probably below the average for someone of normal weight if you exercise a lot and eat the right food. So definitely I would say to people, don't just focus on, if you focus on weight alone, and particularly if you focus on weight by calorie restriction, you're likely to struggle, to continue to struggle. And then the other one, so short supply chains are fine if you happen to be in a country like ours, which could feed itself. So DEFRA did a study, the last one was about 8 years ago, something like that, 10 years ago maybe, where they did a kind of academic study. Could the UK, if we had a U-boat threat, if we were sealed off, could we feed ourselves? Within a year and a half or so, we could. We'd had to eat less meat, funnily enough, was one of the things they decided, but you could feed yourself. But that isn't an option for Egypt. So Egypt currently, even if it was all of its farms are farming as productive as they could, it imports about half its food. It imports a lot of grain from Ukraine. So the way in which populations are distributed around the planet is because we worked out, got very effective at moving calories around the planet. In fact, Athens was the first state, so old Athens was the first state that had to import more food than it produced. It imported it from the top of the Black Sea, and we've got very good at that. So no, unless you want to, and Egypt's population is going to double in the next 20 years. So unless you want to have massive population movement, you cannot have all local systems. In terms of industrialized production, I think you're going to see an approach where on the one side you have we have ecosystems. Now, we've been farming for so long, there are whole ecosystems that live on the farm. You can't get, just through wild nature and monocrop, you can't get the richness of biodiversity. So what you're going to see is wildlife, farms where intentionally you have nature on the farm and lower yields. You intentionally manage the lower yields, regenerative forms of farming. And then you will continue to have industrial agriculture, monocrops, but they increasingly will use fewer inputs, less destructive inputs, but there will always be a role for a field which doesn't leach harm out of the field, where basically you are optimizing that field just for one crop. Probably will actually have much more complex undersoil life than it currently does. So I think you'll see a range of different approaches.
Again, we've got two questions in the audience, so we'll go to Toby first and then a lady over here. Toby.
Thanks. Do you think part of the problem is that the Green Revolution was so successful with providing food for humanity that we've kind of taken it for granted after that, and it's just not valued enough?
Yes. So, well, yeah, I think the two problems, yes, it is, we do take it for granted. You know, if you look at what my grandparents had to eat, you know, the cost of if you look at the cost of a chicken, we used to eat beef and the amount of beef and chicken we ate was roughly the other way around, because beef used to be cheaper than chicken, and now chicken's cheap. We eat a lot of it. We have we talk in the thing about like what is food security? Like, is food security, as I can do in Hackney, being able to buy an avocado from my corner shop on Christmas Day? You know, so what level of food security are you, do you want for a country? So I think we have become to take it for granted. But I think more importantly, we have had the costs hidden from us. That is the problem. Now, you cannot immediately if any government were immediately to put the cost back up to double the price of food, they would fall. So the question then is, and we go into this quite a lot in the food strategy, how do you get those costs in such a way that ingenuity is constantly bringing the price down a bit as you're increasing the cost, so you don't lose power, which effectively, you know, not having enough food is the way a lot of governments in the past have fallen. So it's a tricky kind of series of manoeuvres.
Yeah, really good point. And also mentioned about how costs of foods have changed. Red meat consumption has dropped since the 1950s, but poultry has risen by 307%. So actually understanding that and where that reduction will come from. Yeah. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
The protein content of wheat, how will that change as the temperature goes up?
It's a very good question. Do you know the answer to that?
Toby might. Yes. Actually, it'll probably a dilution effect. It'll possibly go down, but I know micronutrient content will possibly go down. Was that your question? Sorry. Yes.
Yes, I understand that the protein content of wheat is down now by 5% in Europe.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So Rothamsted, where you used to work. So,
and Toby.
Sorry?
You both, Toby and I were from...
Toby, so Rothamsted, they have a field of wheat, and they've been collecting the seeds from, way back when. And in fact, if you go down to the vault, and they're all in these lovely glass jars. And then during the war, they couldn't get hold of the glass jars, so they're all in like Bisto tins and like things that they've had. But they've got all these wheats, and it is the case for a lot of food. So people say, well, our food is not as nutritious as it used to be. That isn't always true. So, for example, tomatoes are much more genetically diverse because we farmed them for flavour and nutrition than they used to be. But in that Rothamsted wheat, it is definitely the case that over time, a lot of the nutrients have come down. And my guess is that is because they were farming they were farming for yield, but they couldn't get the high yield, so there was less water in there. There was more micronutrients in the soil, and so on and so forth. But yes, there are definitely nutrient problems with some food. Funny enough, Beeswax Dyson, and they did. I'm not sure they actually succeeded. They didn't succeed in the end, but they were trying to. Which is one of our big farms. They were trying to work with British Kite Mark to kite mark a carrot. They felt that carrots were one of those things, which actually makes sense. If you taste a carrot, it tastes like there's a lot of water in it these days. They thought carrots were one of these crops where the nutrition profile had fallen. They wanted to kite mark a Beeswax Dyson nutritional carrot and sell it at a premium. So farm it in a way that made it more nutrient dense. And actually, I see people shaking their heads. I quite like that because I think that if someone did that very quickly, it would force, the rest of the market to respond, and you'd change the way people farm more generally.
I think the Rothamsted data has clearly shown that the nitrogen effect in terms of dilution is a lower level of micronutrients, particularly zinc, when they were looking at that wheat data. But I didn't know about the carbon dioxide specifically. Yes, there's a question here. And then there's one here. So if we can have a helper change the microphone to over here. And the question at the back. Yes, please.
Yeah, mine is really rolls on the sort of fourth you gave of actually actually achieving these changes. You mentioned the problems that people with low incomes have. I have a number of neighbours that don't have low incomes. They're not poor in that respect, but they're time poor. I can sit and watch deliveries going into their houses every day. They have small children, which I guess is are being fed in this way and brought up. So certainly your work that you've been conducting in schools and bringing that along and getting children interested in their diets, and not just taking what is given to them because it tastes good, I think is vital.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is time. There is a time poor, and we have lost. We've broken the link, and it's the cooking. Obviously, you used to have one member of the family, normally the woman, who would stay at home and do all the cooking, and that isn't the case anymore. Thank goodness. But what has happened is there is now no one who has those skills, and it's actually my first job was as a chef. I can get home, look at what's in the fridge, and cook something. I cook all the meals in our house. I can cook for our 3 kids and my wife very quickly, and that is because I was trained and had those skills. And unless if I look at what my wife's mother is just the most, she's not only a great cook, she still does things like when her sheets run out, she cuts them in the middle, turns them around, and sews them back in the middle. Like the skills of that generation, and we've lost those skills because we go to work, and actually. You do need to get those skills back in. Funny enough, I think that things like these box schemes like HelloFresh and Gusto and those things, I think they're quite interesting. we ordered one just to try it. My 11-year-old daughter, who'd never cooked more than an omelette or never really shown an interest, pushed me away. I said, I'll help. She said, no, and she cooked for all of us, at this dinner. So I do think there are ways in which we might be able to turn our online fascination with food into actually something that's real.
Right, the audience are warming up now, Henry. There's a lot of questions waiting. So we'll go here first, and then Liam. Chris.
So, Henry, firstly, I'd like to congratulate you on achieving the first stage of the impossible, because bringing together, such a complex document, so nuanced as the food system is incredible. I see yourself and Professor Tim Lang as the real sort of leaders on this nationally. I was lucky enough to see Tim Lang speak just before the pandemic here at Keele, which was phenomenal. But down to business. So here in Stoke-on-Trent, we have one of the highest deprivation rates in young children. Just below Tower Hamlets, which has the highest in the UK at around 40%. So there's some work to do locally. And I think it is about taking responsibility locally within our communities, within the cities and towns. They provide great nuance in their own right for us to find ways to move that forward, to shift the needle, if you like. One thing that we're doing as an organisation is we're working with a school, using their allotment to grow local ingredients. We're also working with kids on the verge of exclusion to help them find a way. And I actually think that one of the nuances around diet, nutrition, well-being and being human is actually understanding what it is to be human. An MP, a local MP, asked me, how do we get people to be more healthy? And I actually think it's far less about, dare I say, I'm a food educationalist principally. I think it's far less about food education and more to do with understanding who we are and understanding the reasons why we make the choices we make. I think that's where the power is. I can understand why a government might kick against that.
Was that Jo Gideon?
It was Jo Gideon, yeah.
She really gets it, Jo.
Yeah. I said that to her, and so for me, I invite you to bring the Chefs in Schools program to Stoke to work with us in the school that we're working with, and to really work closer together. How do we start that process? In Stoke-on-Trent we're a post-industrial city, and I believe if Josiah Wedgwood was here now, that was the way he thought, he'd have the answers. And we're a very green city. We are the blueprint waiting to happen, I believe. We just have to find a way to feed people.
Yeah. I think there are two things there. So one is we have a real problem with wealth distribution in this country, and the food system can't fix that. I was listening to something this morning, and it made me think about walking around Stoke, going from here and walking around this area, and he was talking about how we've regenerated quite a lot of this centre of Manchester, centre of Liverpool, centre of Nottingham, centre of Leeds. They're all actually, centre of Newcastle, they're all look great, much better than they did 20 years ago. But he met some walkers, Dutch walkers, who were walking Hadrian's Wall, and they'd started in the middle of Newcastle. And it's not, you don't have to go far before you are in, the Dutch were what is going on? This is just terrible. We haven't seen anything like this poverty. And I think that is a huge problem. It's not going to be fixed by the food system. And certainly I don't know how to fix it. But I do think that, therefore, in the meantime, we work with Chefs in Schools with 30 to 40% free school meals, and just trying to do what you can for people who are living in those situations to make it better. I'd love to. We've done some stuff in Sheffield, and we've done some stuff now down in Devon and Cornwall. So send me an email and get my email after this, and I'd love to work with you. It'd be great. Find out what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Right, we'll go to Liam. There's a question at the back.
Liam Sinclair, Harper Adams. Thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation, Henry. This point has been touched on a number of times previously, but when we have a situation where successive governments focus on inflation and controlling inflation, and within that calculation, food is a major aspect, and when that is then reinforced by supermarkets who are telling consumers that they will always be lowering prices and every little counts, we have a situation where people have never spent as little on food as part of their disposable income. they've never had a greater choice of food available. So all the products that you're promoting are available now, but people choose not to. And in many cases, it isn't primarily because of cost. It's primarily because food is deemed to be a lower value product within what people want to spend their money on. So those are major sort of societal differences that we need to get round if we want food to be higher up the agenda and to achieve that. And whilst short-term aspects such as providing vouchers for fruit and vegetable are very supportive of, they're not really going to tackle the long-term problem of how society values food and how that then filters back into how producers produce that food to meet that market. Because ultimately producers will follow what the market wants, and if the market wants to produce those things, then they will produce it.
Absolutely. So that is, you're describing there both the junk food cycle and the invisibility of nature, which is business will do, I don't mean this in a bad way, they will do, their job is to do what makes the money, and if they don't do it, someone else will do it. We can leave aside whether or not it's a rational thing for a government to think they can control inflation, but they certainly don't want to make it worse, and therefore that is why I think that the environmental switch, where the costs wouldn't be as apparent, is I'm more optimistic than the health switch. But even with the health switch, actually, I think you could make some of that stuff better without making it much more expensive. And also, if you look at, we did some modelling about what the kind of, even like a sugar and salt reformulation tax, even if they didn't reformulate, how much would it add to the price of a Mars bar or thing of jam? Less than the food inflation we've experienced significantly less than the food inflation in the last 12 months. But I think the problem is, how do you, this is one of the big problems. The food system is one of the big problems that developed and increasingly developing countries more because they feel the effects of it, face. And a serious government could take a grip of it, but the question is, and will at some point, the question is how bad it has to get. Because if you think about the people who go into politics, where they're listening, what they're listening to, what they're doing, they generally don't find, somehow there's something about the food system they just don't find interesting, even though it's clearly, in COP26, it was the biodiversity COP. So it was like where we deal with biodiversity and carbon in Glasgow. And the food system, despite it being basically the thing that is destroying biodiversity, didn't feature there at all. Like the biodiversity was all about wild spaces, which is a tiny percentage of the problem. So I think it is not inevitable, but it requires a lot more political application than currently we see.
And the School of Sustainable Food and Farming at Harper Adams was at the Tory Party conference yesterday, launching a report on Hungry to Learn, which has been led by the Lifelong Learning Centre, which is exactly that point, Henry, so critical. And we need to get the COPs clearly in that focus.
I think that in Dubai there's a bit more on food, isn't there? Because obviously for Dubai it's they're much more serious about food than we are, because it's a very difficult problem for them.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got two more questions. So we've got a question here, and if you've got another one, please. I'm going to extend it because this is too good to end. So we're going to extend it, if that's okay. Henry, a little bit more discussion. Yep. You're quite happy? So I've got a question here, then Iona at the back. So over here first, and then over there.
Hi, I'm Sharon George from Kiel. And just first of all, just to sort of say thank you. It's really, really enlightening. But I've just got a question about your thoughts on perception. And right now we are, Stoke-on-Trent has a very high level of dependence on things like food banks. There's huge perception around food and a lot of pride around food as well. So some of the projects that our students are very sustainably minded at Kiel. So and quite a lot of our students have done projects where we've worked with communities and community food and perception and improving things. But it can be seen very much as a class thing. If you eat this posh vegan food or this healthy nutritious stuff, there is that kind of that barrier to engagement in community food projects, I think sometimes. And how in a society where time is an issue, and our houses have got bigger and our gardens have got smaller, and people don't have allotments anymore, and we have got that decoupling. Where do you think we're going? We're going to see more. We are seeing climate change refugees right now. We are going to see a change in society, and climate change is putting pressure on food systems, and food prices are going up, especially those cheaper things that those in society that need those things more are being hit hardest first. So how do we decouple that, as moving forward? Because I think what I'm seeing are students very engaged with this, and younger people have got enthusiasm for this. They just don't know how. What do you think we could do? Have you got any advice for?
Wow, that's a tough one.
So I think a couple of things. I think that the younger people is really interesting, and I don't, there's kind of one theory of thought that younger people change their views as they get older, but actually with something like this, I was reading about this historian. She'd done a textual analysis of flat earthers. So she'd looked at everyone who was writing at the time of Galileo about whether the earth was flat or round, and she meticulously tracked all of the sources, and she didn't find anyone who changed their mind. Basically what happened was the flat earth people died, and the younger generation came believing the world is round. And I do think with some of these issues, I'm quite hopeful that that is what will happen. It's not that they'll all turn into over-consuming bad people. I just think they feel this and they will realise that it is an important issue. And I think it's a 30-year transition as well. At this school, I said to the kids, look, you're all sitting here thinking we fucked everything up for you, but I tell you, in 25 years' time, you're going to be standing on this stage and your kids will think you fucked everything up for them. So you better stop moaning and start doing something about it. But the thing about the other thing I would say about the kind of middle class issue. So when we did launch the food strategy, I went on the Today programme to talk about it, and Nick Robinson said, "Aren't you just a posh person telling poor people what to eat?" And I said, "It is only a posh privileged person telling." I said, "It is only a rich privileged person." I said, "It's only rich privileged people who ever put that to me." So if you go to a school, there are definitely things you have to change. So when we go to a school, like how quickly you can, and you will have experienced this, how quickly you can move with the children depends on what they're eating at home. You have to think about them as people, and you're trying to train them, and we go from fried fish, on a Friday, to breaded fish, to roasted fish, to fish and tomato sauce over like a 3-year period in a school. And then we have in some of the most deprived schools in Hackney, we now regularly do this kind of fake soil. It looks completely like a kind of ottolenghi thing, fake soil with radishes and carrots in it. The kids love it because they eat them out of the soil, and the soil's made of sesame seeds, etc., etc. So I think that is just nonsense, and you just have to don't listen to it. You have to make sure you're not imposing your values, your food values on people, but you have to, with children and societies, everyone wants to eat well. It's not like aren't concerned. If you go and talk to people, as I've done a lot of, like signing people into food banks, done it 3 times, they all know that they want to do it better. They're just struggling to find out how they fit that into their lives and their budget. So I would ignore the middle class stuff completely and be hopeful for the youth.
Again, really great advice. Iona.
Iona from Harper Adams University. I really like so many things that you talked about today, and one of the things is about a government-led approach, government-led interventions, and the other one is systematic approach. I wanted to ask you a question about using those for managing the food waste. So because we know that in the whole world and also in the UK, food waste, 33%, so 1/3 of the food post-farm has been wasted. But if you add the on-farm loss, that's about 45% of all food produced has been wasted. And research have shown if we can halve the food loss and waste, then we can actually feed everybody, particularly on the fruit and the vegetable side. And so my question to you is, I really think that government-led intervention seems to be really effective. You know, the examples you talked about, the smoking is a great example of success, transformational change. Do you think we need actually more government-led interventions, mandatory legislations, to use a food supply system rather than just legislation on, for example, retailers? We actually need a legislation to say the whole system needs to be halved, not just retailers needs to be halved. And secondly is also about food donation, surplus food donation. And we know retailers tend to have lots of surplus food. And in Europe, France and Italy, they have legislation to make it mandatory for all supermarkets to donate any food unsold to human. And do you think the UK should also have that?
So I completely agree. So we actually, when I talk about waste, about meat, we actually said we need to stop wasting food, but we said that's not just food waste, the 30% we throw away, it's also resource waste, so farming in an inefficient way, wasting land, and it's meat. So those are the three ways. On food waste, in this country, our supermarkets actually they waste by far the least of any part of the pie chain because they're brilliant at pushing it into the home and pushing it back on their suppliers. And so the question then is, how do you stop that? I actually think the home one is the most difficult, and the home one is the biggest. By the time you get food wasted in the home, normally it's been dug up, driven to a processing plant, cooked or done, whatever it is, taken to the supermarket, sat there refrigerated, driven to someone's house, been cooked again on a oven, put in the fridge, and then thrown away. So that is the worst. That waste is worse than any other kind of waste. And actually, and we have actually with that waste, with RAP, we've done quite well. We've reduced it quite a lot in this country. We're not where Holland are, and there are a number of things that we need to do to make that happen. The biggest single lever, which was where this, again, fake news 7 bins thing that you might have come across, is actually to make people separate out food waste, because when you see it, you stop wasting it. So I think we need to do that, and then we've made some other recommendations about how you deal with the supply chain. But with all these things, the role of government is to intervene when the market is failing, and clearly it's failing here. So generally, to your point, yes, you need government intervention if you want to solve these problems.
Okay, thank you very much, Henry. You've been extremely generous with your time and giving us an extra 20 minutes for Q&A. Please, can we all thank Henry Dimbleby for a fantastic lecture. So, thank you very much, Henry. And thank you all for being so engaged, and everybody online as well. So our sincere thanks to our speaker, Henry Dimbleby. Unfortunately, it has not been possible to arrange a book signing because apparently Keele doesn't have a bookstore. So maybe you want to come to Harper Adams anyway. I don't think we've got a bookstore either. But Ravenous is online and available, so people can buy it and send it to Henry to sign it. I'm sure he'll do it and post it back to you.
And my wife, Jemima Lewis, who's slightly upset about the relative sizes of the fonts on this cover, I have to say. But notwithstanding that, a lot of the simplicity of the ideas was thanks to her just saying, what do you actually mean? Having like an editor who forces you to write things in plain English is incredibly useful. She spent hours and hours unpaid on this work. So
yeah, I think more scientists need to.
Scientists definitely need that.
Absolutely. So thanks also to those who helped to move with the smooth running of today's event. So Tim Lustig, Professor Tim Lustig. Round of applause. Director of ILS. The team from Keele Conferencing and Events. So round of applause. Our AVS team and the helpers, thank you very much. And Steve Kilner, particularly in ILAS. And of course you, for all your great involvement. One announcement before I let you go for something to eat. Our next Global Challenge lecture will be presented by Her Excellency Dr. Farah Faisal, High Commissioner of the Maldives to the United Kingdom and Kiel alumni. Her lecture is titled Small State to the Crossroads, Does the Maldives Matter? It's another one of our hybrid events taking place on the 18th of October here at 6 p.m. at Kiel Hall, and also available online. And full details will be available on the ILAS website, and you can register there. Thank you all once again. Thank you again to Henry. Thank you.